So we have Helen Degeling, Project Acquisition Manager from Cobalt Blue Holdings, joining us today. We have Stephen Marshall, Director of New Technology, Weir Minerals. We have Bernadette Currie, Business and Project Development Manager, Metals, Sedgman. And Shane Goodwin, Director of SC Group. Can we please give him a round of applause for joining us today on the panel? So the panel discussion today is how can tailings become an emerging market opportunity? And what we're really going to do in this panel discussion, I hope, is it's going to be solutions focused on where to find opportunities, what are the options for achieving those, and how can we create those market opportunities from tailings? So my first question is going to be handed over to Helen. And in your prior role at the Geological Survey Queensland, you were instrumental in the program for mapping mine tailings across Queensland to identify those secondary prospects for critical minerals. Your new role, however, at Cobalt Blue involves finding suitable cobalt pyrite tailings. Does Australia have governance frameworks that would enable a company like Cobalt Blue to easily develop a project to recover resources from tailings across multiple states and territories?
Thanks, Sarah. And as I said in my opening notes, this is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. So glad to be up here with these other amazing and wonderful people. I think one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of talks is, particularly from Jane's talk earlier, the data is a real issue and something that governments can take a really, really forward-thinking role in filling that gap. So waste, we're talking about waste here. We're talking about something that is considered a liability, and most people don't want to spend money developing an understanding of, doing analyses of something that is essentially trash because it has no value. Why would you spend money on it? So I think that the National Mine Waste Atlas, the work that Anita's doing, the work that GA is doing, and the work that all the states are doing is really, really fantastic in filling that gap in terms of generating interest, demonstrating that there is value, that there is potential, and essentially it's pre-competitive data, just like we use in exploration to find new deposits. This is data that we can use to find new opportunities in something that's sitting around at surface, you know, in many cases causing a lot of environmental harm. I'm not going to touch on the regulatory aspects of how governments can help, because I know that that's going to be covered down the end there. But look, nobody's going to explore for or take advantage of something that we don't know about. So filling that knowledge gap is a really key part of what government can do to support these opportunities.
Thank you, Helen. I'll hand over now to Stephen. Weir Minerals, they're adopting technologies and processes that extract functional particles from existing tailings. Can you explain what functional particles are and how they are creating new markets whilst reducing tailings?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you think about tailings is the end product of a massive size reduction process. And because it comes at the end of the process, it contains a range of particle sizes, and there are a number of uses that those particles can be put to by exploiting those different particle sizes. Okay, so the first and obvious application, which I mentioned in my talk earlier today, is the use of or extraction of sand from the tailings to be used as a dam wall construction material. So a lot of work has been done in South America looking at geotechnical work, that is, looking at what characteristics that sand has to have to form a stable dam wall. And it turns out that sand is actually a fantastic construction material for dams because it's earthquake resistant, and because it's an earthquake prone country. And it turns out that the sand rearranges itself. It doesn't crack, it doesn't break, it just forms a rearranged structure. But in order for that to have those properties, you have to minimize the amount of fines that are contained in the sand. Okay, so that's the critical factor. And people talk about minus 200 mesh, minus 75 micron. A bit technical, apologies for that. But the the criterion is typically less than 15% below 75 microns. And if you can achieve that as a material, that's a perfect construction material because it drains quickly. The water drains out of it very quickly. It can be transported, and it can be just put onto dam walls directly. So that's an example of actually, I suppose, a circular economy type of concept that happens within the mine site ecosystem. I think beyond that, I think there's products such as shotcrete, concrete, all of which I'm not a geotechnical expert, but it requires a grading of particle sizes. And as long as there's nothing toxic or contaminating within the tailings stream, we have technologies, hydrocyclones, that kind of stuff, to create the gradings that are required for effective concrete or concrete additives. So I think that's basically what I mean by the functional particle concept. Does that make sense?
Yep. And just to follow on with that though, Stephen, can you give us some examples around where it has successfully been employed?
Yeah, sure. I gave a couple of examples in my talk earlier. We have quite a number of sites in South America, big dams, where they're in the process of raising the dam wall, the height of the dam wall, and they're using sand for that. So we have a technology called DE cyclones, which is 2 stages of cycloning in one. Very simple technology, very easy to apply. There's a bit of secret sauce for how we do it. We have all sorts of internal sort of characteristics or geometric features inside the cyclone to achieve that. So Las Tortolas is one. There's a QB2, Quebrada Blanca Phase 2. We have a massive installation there, which has the capacity to produce maybe up to 40,000 tons plus per day of sand to be used, for the dam wall construction. And more sites to come. And I think what we're trying to do within Weir, and we're busy, this is part of that promotion, I suppose, if I'm totally honest, which is it's established in South America, but we need to spread the word elsewhere because there's so much potential in all of the mine sites that happen across the globe to actually use the sand for that purpose. So that's, yeah, but it's just very simple cycloning technology. And if we need to produce precise grades, there's other technologies that we can bring into play as well, upcurrent classification, that kind of stuff.
Thanks. So Helen mentioned a very critical part here around actually understanding what you've got in your tailings. And then obviously once you've got that information, you've got you've identified where your critical minerals are, you've got the potential for secondary prospects. I've also then heard tailings processing, reverse mining, critical mineral rescue, which I love that term, by the way. It all really sounds good. But realistically, Bernadette, can tailings be the answer to securing critical mineral supply lines?
Thanks, Sara, for the question. And I'm just really glad to be part of this discussion that is in support of and in alignment with sustainable mining practices and mitigating the negative impact on tailings on our ecosystems. For me, probably the key to unlocking tailings as a market opportunity and securing them as a supply of critical minerals is a shift from seeing tailings as an amorphous waste blob that must be managed and reduced in volume, and looking at actually what Helen mentioned is what's actually contained and what's the format of what's contained, and doing it with robust, rigorous feasibility studies and mineral classification in the same way that you would do for a primary greenfield in-ground resource. And that will give you the ability to really quantify value contained and prove recoverability. And then in that way, it's the same viability criterion test work that's required. And what it really means is that we will find that some of these tailings opportunities will not stack up. But for those that do, they should be then opportunities that the market can invest in. And we feel there's actual sound basis for going forward on an economic basis to process them. So that's how. There's more good news, which is the ESG benefits of getting metals from tailings are well recognized. There's less water to be used and less energy consumed. So, and that's because, as Stephen mentioned, most of the size reduction and liberation has already been done. That's good. It means that we can actually brand the metals produced from tails as a more green product. We can, as a sector, celebrate this success of the circular economy to generate critical minerals from a more sustainable source. So those are all positive things. And then I will end the question by saying that that's the good news. Obviously, asset owners cannot just take tailings reprocessing and stick it in their value generation pipeline as we will do this, because the reality is that primary processes, particles and size fractions were deliberately suppressed or rejected in round one. So if you just try and stick them back through the same plant or process plant or concentrator, why would we expect them to report differently? Which means that likely there's a new technology, adapted flow sheet, or different solutions that need to apply, all coming with a capital cost. So there's that aspect. And where you have new flow sheets or new technologies, maybe there is also some permitting required. There's also the aspect that it's potentially the tails produced in round two are more deleterious or hazardous than they were the first time. There might be more acid mine drainage forming. They might require detoxification or neutralization. They may have even increased in volume based on some of those other required steps. So those are some of the hurdles that are presenting for tailings reprocessing. Many of the solutions to those hurdles exist, and they're out there on the expo floor and with the OEMs and consultancies, so they can be found. That's the good news.
So Helen, I'll just come back to you with Cobalt Blue. I believe you are looking at pyrite tailings as a potential source for Cobalt Blue. Could you explain a little bit more about how you go about those assessments?
Sure. So Cobalt Blue has a cobalt and nickel in pyrite deposit down near Broken Hill. So that's our primary ore body. Within the company, my role is to look for opportunities in mine tailings, because our processing flow sheet has been developed specifically to unlock pyrite, to break down pyrite as the focus of the processing, essentially. So where do you find large accumulations of pyrite? Not necessarily in the ground. It often ends up in tailings, because in a lot of copper mines or nickel mines or other metalliferous mines, the metal value is largely in other minerals like chalcopyrite, like pentlandite, other minerals they might be sulfide minerals, but other minerals where the density of the metal is higher. So the pyrite is a lower value mineral. It's selected out. It ends up in the tailings pile. It's one of the main contributors to acid mine drainage. So for us, selection of sites is very, very much around that mineralogy component, and specifically pyrite as a target. And there are metals locked up within pyrite. It can contain cobalt and nickel. It can contain gold. It can contain copper. Any range of things. It's a bit of a junkyard kind of a mineral. It can also contain, to Bernadette's point, deleterious elements such as arsenic. So that's something that we certainly have to deal with, and we can. But it does again add cost. So all of these things are possible, but the economics sort of come down to that. But one of the byproducts of our process, because we're breaking down that pyrite, is elemental sulfur. So we're actually able to remove that acid forming component and reduce the acid forming potential of those mine waste stockpiles. So we can get metal value out, but we can also generate a more positive environmental outcome, which is quite attractive, is more attractive for some partners than the metal potential in the tailings itself. So it's good.
Perfect. So just on that note again, so you mentioned economic. Bernadette, in our pre-discussion, you talked about the unicorn. So what are some key criteria that can be used to determine the feasibility of reprocessing tailings?
Yeah, well, I hope they're not a unicorn as in non-existent, but I do think that they have to be picked out of the field. Probably I would say the criterias are one, accessibility of the tails, and I don't just mean can you reach them, can you reach them, and the variability and recoverability of any residual value. Was there a byproduct ignored first time around? Are they easy enough to dewater? Can the remaining residual solid waste be repurposed? So I kind of divide it into a matrix. Obviously, large-scale mining produces massive amounts of tailings in terms of volume, but we can look at it as two options. Are they coming from a fresh source? Are you targeting them as they directly are discharged from a processing plant? Maybe that's on one axis. And that would mean you have much lower rehandling costs. It takes out a whole lot of associated OPEX with remining. Or are they historic? They're already contained in a TSF. They could have been there for quite some time. They're going to require a remining and potentially a polishing step to make them as easy to treat as if they were fresh. They could be at depth. They could be covered with a lot of not so valuable material. They could be even pose problems for your existing operation where there's a challenge to deposit the remined and reprocessed tails and your fresh tails from your operation. You could be even sterilizing portions of your TSF. So maybe in that case, older operations that have small, multiple, shallow TSFs that they can kind of pick and choose from are more amenable. So there's this fresh versus historic question. And then the one that Helen has already touched on is are you targeting the residual residual primary product, in which case for how many years were you running at modest to acceptable recovery. Maybe an example might be you were running at 80% recovery on a 1.5% feed, and you plan to target now the residual value, that 20% that was left at 90% recovery. You're really only chasing just over 0.25% head grade. Then the economics really start to not stack up. You have to have an operation perhaps that was running for many years with the wrong operating regime, wrong reagents, or they were chasing tons. Maybe you can talk about that example where it was a throughput over recovery an example, and so you know there's a bit more value there. And then we swing to the other option, which is the one where you're now processing for a byproduct that was not previously targeted. That is probably fresh tails in that scenario is probably the most prospective, but we typically require a new CapEx, a new installation of technology for that one. And then there's the question of dewatering. If you can do the dewatering at the same time as you realize value, then that's a win-win. However, there's one little caveat. Sometimes reprocessing and whatever you hit it with, whether it's further size reduction or leaching, actually makes the dewatering a bit more challenging with the fines and so forth, as Stephen would say. So there's that challenge. And then the final one is it amenable to whatever's left over, maybe the devoid of value aluminosilicates, can they be repurposed? As we have mentioned, it is an option to feed these final waste materials into other building products or backfills, other potential destinations for them. And those are not typically value creating, but they certainly can solve the problem of what to do with the tails and make them go away, so to speak. So if you look at all of that in a flow chart, you might end up with a winner, and there are some opportunities that meet all those criteria.
Yeah, I think what you've highlighted there is tailings isn't the magic answer to our critical mineral supply lines. And
not low-hanging fruit, no.
Yes. So finding the right tailings to reprocess is critical. And I'm going to then ask Shane. Obviously, Jane mentioned before that New Century Mine was one that is actually doing some of this great work. Can you just share your experience with, I guess, the statutory and the regulatory hurdles that you encountered, particularly in resource classification of those tailings, and how you overcame them?
Sure, or whether we did overcome them is another question.
When you overcome them, yes.
So for those who aren't familiar, we founded New Century Resources in 2017 after we acquired the old Century Mine from its previous owners. Now, I think Bernadette and Helen have both talked about the economic challenges involved with reprocessing tailings or reprocessing waste from mining, and I often talk about who are the people, who are the companies that are going to be doing the reprocessing, and I tend to think it's not the bigger miners that have these massive primary ore assets and have been working on these primary ore assets. It will be the next level down company. New Century Resources was only ever a $200 million market cap company, so we were hyper exposed to the kinds of liabilities and the kinds of regulation that government had been imposing on a traditional mining environment. So to take one example, in Queensland, you have to provide a financial provisioning bond for your areas of disturbance. That includes your tailings storage facility. That was our ore body. We drilled it out. We proved it up as a JORC reserve at that tailings storage facility. So from our perspective, it was no longer a liability. This was an asset. It was a changed way of thinking about this asset. Unfortunately, the Queensland government didn't think about it the same way, and they required us, and still require us, to provide it's about $40 million worth of surety for a cover system on tailings storage facility that will never have a cover system applied to it. We've mined more than half of that tailings storage facility now, but that $40 million is still sitting with the government now, and that's $40 million that made life very difficult for New Century over the time of our operations. And I think you mentioned, Sara, the reverse mining aspect to it, and I think it's really important that the government looks at what industry is doing and thinks about ways to encourage this, because it can be a really positive way to extend the economic life of an operation and to achieve positive environmental outcomes. But legislation hasn't kept up with what industry can do in this space.
So just on that note, do you believe the government is starting to shift their sort of standard application approval models? And also, what advice would you give others looking to reverse mine?
Think very carefully about it. As Bernadette said, and Helen was talking about it as well, really get an understanding of what you have first. I like the idea of thinking about a waste facility as an asset and really understanding what's in there. But when you go through that process, firstly, think about whether this really can be converted into something else. So start there. For someone who's thinking about starting a new reprocessing operation, I would approach the government very, very early and get an understanding of what the impediments potentially are, what the hurdles are, and work proactively with government in an effort to address those. Start early, because if you move too quickly into starting your operation, we had our operation up and running just over 12 months after we acquired the asset. We hadn't given government enough time to keep up with us on what might need to happen. So we found ourselves always complaining about the government position, the regulatory position that we were in. But are things changing? Yeah, the rhetorical position of government has changed, very much so. And we see some efforts, particularly up in Queensland, we're seeing some efforts to understand what's needed from what industry needs in order to progress this. The wheels of government move slowly and perhaps not quickly enough for some in industry like me, but we are seeing that changed attitude, and hopefully that will lead to regulatory change in future.
Yeah, I think if we're going to meet the demand that all the forecasters are sort of saying that we're going to have to meet the energy transition, I think, governments, we do need to see that shift.
They have to be part of that journey. Yeah.
So I know there's drinks out there, but we still have a couple more questions. Bear with us. I want to ask all the panel members, and I might start off with Stephen. Will tailings become an emerging market opportunity in Australia, in your opinion?
I think potentially it can be. Yeah, absolutely. I think I really appreciated the presentations yesterday from the UQ SMI team looking at ore sand. I think there's a big potential there. I think a couple of things actually in that regard. Firstly, the missing piece, I think, at the moment with that potential is the end user, right? I'm not sure that we've actually engaged end users to the extent that's needed. Concrete manufacturers, the Holcims of this world. What can they accept? What do they not accept? Like right now, we have a criterion for construction sand that it has to be pure silica sand. I'm not sure that that's really necessary in all applications that require concrete. You know, you can have concrete for roads, you can have concrete for non-aesthetic applications, you can have concrete within the mine sites, etc., etc. So I think there's a whole range of applications where there's a potential there, but that requires a third party to come in. It requires the end user to come in and be part of that conversation. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing I think that's really critical, which touches on government, which is, and to give the example of Latin America, is that mining companies work extensively with geotechnical experts, with government inspectors and so on and so forth to make sure that what they construct is safe. And they have legislation, it's all legislated, it's all sorted basically. I think in Australia, I think we're miles behind. I don't think people are really starting to think about sand for dam wall construction so much. We're catching up, but we have this state-by-state concept, which is tricky to navigate. There's no real sort of centralisation and sharing, as far as I know. I'm not an expert, but as far as I can see, and from the customers that I talk to. So I think if we can clear those hurdles, if we can get interested end users on board and part of that conversation, I think if we can clear the hurdles legislatively in terms of, and it's fair enough, right? It's got to be safe. But if we can get through those hurdles, I think there's enormous potential, because we, you know, globally, so I'm probably taking too long, right?
No, it's outside that I think we're smiling at each other about.
Right. Yeah, so globally, 12 billion tonnes of construction sand is consumed. Globally, we produce roughly the same quantity of ground tailings. So I'm thinking, surely a large portion of those ground tailings can be used for construction if we can find a connection, if we can find a path to do that. So I think that's a very long answer, but yes, the answer. I think the answer to the question is yes. I think there's tremendous potential.
And I agree with you on the end user one. I mean, that's a critical component, like within the high purity alumina, the visibility in what your different end users really need in those purity levels. Unless you're inside, you don't really understand what they want. So I'll throw that out to the other panelists, maybe Bernadette.
Yeah, because I can comment on what you said. I think the pathway is there and the R&D has been done to develop what materials are available. Problem might be actually one of timing and logistics. When you develop a region, build a new mine, that's when these materials are needed for road bases, for concrete, for all of the infrastructure, and the tailings is coming after much later, and then the tailings solution or the elimination of said tailings is actually the afterthought. If we could somehow redo that sequence so that new mines are, and there's obviously a geographical challenge in there because just transporting material alone costs money. So if we can try and find better ways to think about where we develop and it has to go outside the bounds of one company, because they usually go into a region, they only build what they're planning to build or what they've invested to develop. So we need to do that in a more sensible way so that those materials become available to people that are starting fresh from people who are already established. That's one thing. And the idea of the tailings for critical minerals as a market opportunity, I believe there's such a thing coming in the industry as a passport or a materials passport or a mark about their greenness or how responsibly sourced they are. That could help, because if we have that established, we can prioritize the, I'm not saying, cobalt can't come from primary sources. Helen's looking at me. But we can prioritize those for those specific small market opportunities, and those market opportunities are growing, but they're also changing. We can target whether it's rare earths, vanadium, cobalt, moly, the ones that are coming from tailings already, and we can also educate the market that's investing them about the timelines as well. There is significant savings on a timeline for a tailings to product than a mine from a greenfield perspective to product. So we need to educate the market on just how much of time you can snip off the timeline, and that would be of interest to the downstream users, to the battery manufacturers and automotive manufacturers for the EV transformation. So that's why I think we need to do those things, and yes, it can be an opportunity.
Shane?
Yeah. Look, there's an incredible amount of value wrapped up in mine waste, whether that be in tailings or waste, mineralised waste rock scat stockpiles, even in water. Just an incredible amount of value there. But, without wanting to beat up on governments too much, the governments need to stop treating it like it's a mine, like it's a primary ore mine. And that, it boils down to what approvals exist, the form of tenure that exists. Mining leases don't necessarily work when you're dealing with a waste product in the way that they worked for primary ore mining as well. So there really is a requirement to shift the way governments and regulators are thinking about the reprocessing or extracting value from waste, because it's not primary ore mining, and we do need a different regulatory regime for waste reprocessing, because if we don't get that, then we won't see projects like that develop over time. It won't become the kind of opportunity that we're talking about it could be. We need to see that change.
So I guess the question I have is, how do we shift the mindset of government so that we see that change? Any insights from anyone on the panel?
Well, I've been whinging about it for a few years. Look, I mean, like I said, I started whinging about it, and that didn't get me anywhere. So we have seen, different organisations, like there's environments up in Queensland working with CRI Time. They're working with Queensland government on getting an understanding of what industry thinks it needs in order to make those changes. So like I said, governments do move a bit slower than industry and private sector, but that change is happening. Rather than banging your head against the wall and having a whinge like I did for the first few years, collaborative engagement with government to understand government processes and how they work as agencies as well. They are willing to come on the journey. Governments see the value there, but they also have a responsibility to manage risk for their taxpayers and for their voters as well. So they're very careful about those changes that they make, but they do see the value. They do see that there are opportunities there, and they want to see that value extracted. And
Helen, how are you navigating those, I guess, regulatory components, especially because I assume you're not looking within one state for Cobalt Blue, you're looking multi-states, but potentially internationally as well. Could you give us some insights on what you've found so far?
Definitely. So I've just come back from Europe, where I've spoken to investors and a number of different government agencies, particularly in Germany while I was over there. So there is as much diversity in attitude towards different mining projects and remining projects globally as there is then within Australia as well, given that resources is managed at a state level in our country. So there is, I think, huge, across the board, huge enthusiasm for the concept of value from tailings, but then also paired with the potential environmental and remediation benefits. So whether it's volume reduction in acid generation, and that sort of thing, or removal of waste altogether by looking at the entire, what's the product from the waste, and production of sands or iron-rich residues or all that sort of thing. So there is huge enthusiasm, but ultimately working through legislation that, no matter what state it's in, was designed ultimately for primary mining operations, as Shane pointed out, not for remining or has no capacity for viewing waste as an asset. It's about hand-holding, to be honest, and bringing people along for the journey, keeping everybody informed, all stakeholders, whether it's community, government, to understand what the opportunities are, what the hurdles are, what might be required of them, what part they play, what part we play, and just being open and transparent the whole way along. So storytelling, communication are important.
Again, that visibility factor and letting everyone know what's going on. Wonderful. So we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to throw it out to the panel. If there was one thing that you didn't get to say today in this panel, feel free to say it right now before I close. Any takers?
Yeah,
Stephen?
just yet another comment about sand. Just imagine this, right? Just imagine this. So vast mining operations in South America, just to the west of the Andes, at altitude. Imagine massive sand production from the tailings of those operations, trucked, piped down to the coast by gravity, like free of charge almost, put on, cleaned up and put onto ships and shipped to any capital city around the globe. I mean, that, because the barrier that's usually put in front of that concept of using sand is the transportation distance, right? It's just not effective past about a couple of 100 kilometres. But shipping sand is really cheap, right? Shipping is really, really cheap. So that's just a thought. It's a seed of a thought, but I can imagine a future where that could happen. And I think potentially it's viable. So that's my 2 cents worth.
I'll
Helen?
jump in. Yeah, I've always got something to say. I guess I've got 2 more points that I wanted to make. One comes back to what Shane said about, in general, the companies that are looking at mine waste remining opportunities are small. It doesn't tend to be the really big players. And by that very nature, it therefore needs to be collaborative, because maybe it's the big companies that own the sites where the greatest opportunities are, just purely through volume and grade potential. But bringing other people in, understanding that you're a specialist in one field, but then maybe maybe Cobalt Blue and Weir get together. We
Absolutely.
take the we'll talk later.
Yeah, once you start processing, we've got all the stuff you need.
Yeah, there you go. So we take the metals out, and then our mates come along and get the more inert material and find uses for that. So I think there's a lot of room for a really collaborative approach, but in a way we need to change our business model, because we're very used to single operator, or single owner mines, rather than having, well, this person does this and this person does this and that sort of thing. And then the other thing was when we're talking about using all of that material to help service new mines that are coming in. We can use that recycled construction material, that sort of stuff. I would like to see that whilst there's a lot of mine waste and tailings opportunity now, because we've got tens to hundreds, thousands of years worth of mining history sitting around at surface causing damage and being a pain in the bum, in the future, hopefully there is none of that waste, because we've reprocessed or managed the existing waste, and all of our new operations, now that mindset is embedded into how we go forward. So we've designed out waste of the future mine. There is no tailings dam, because all of the material as part of comes off the plant. The company's got their copper or their zinc or their whatever out, and then the Cobalt Blue or the Weir or the Sedgmans has then said that this is the next step, and these people get this lot out, and then every single aspect of the material that's dug up has value and a use.
Thank you, Helen. So we are out of time. So I'd love to thank our panelists.